welcome back to another video. My name is Jill and today I'm going to be doing my long-awaited best books of 2020. I wrote down a list of all of my favorite books, all of the books that were really close to my heart this year a couple weeks ago, and then as the weeks go on I have been slowly narrowing down my choices and slowly ranking these books. Here is my final list. I ended up coming up with 13 books. I tried to get it to 10, but it just didn't work out. And last night, as I was actually preparing this video, like writing down all the things that I wanted to say about each book, I discovered that I actually had forgotten a book that I was sure was going to make it onto this list, but I guess I had cut it out at some point. So I have one honorable mention here, and I'm not going to talk about for too long, but that is You Should See Me in a Crown by Leah Johnson. This book, I think about it often and just how much fun I had with this book and how joyous it is. Very quickly, it follows a black queer girl that runs for prom queen in order to get like this scholarship to her dream college. It's just so much fun. She ends up falling for one of her fellow prom queen competitors, and it's just honestly such a sweet time, and I highly recommend this one, so I just wanted to mention this one real quick. Okay, so now getting into my actual list. Again, I have 13 books, and I'm going to go from my least favorite to my most favorite, and I still last night was so conflicted between my top two books, which one is my actual favorite, but I'm just going to go with what I wrote down, and you know, it just changes every hour in my head, just know that. So starting with number 13, this is a book that I read really recently and I just had so much fun with it, and that is Wicked Fox by Kat Cho. This is a Korean mythology inspired urban fantasy that follows a nine-tailed fox named Miyoung, and one night she ends up saving this human boy named Ji-hoon from another supernatural attack. And from there, the two kind of have to team up to deal with the repercussions of that night, and they grow closer and they fall in love. And this is heavily inspired by Korean dramas, like K-dramas, and I really felt that while reading this book. And I personally love Korean drama. I've watched so many of them, so this felt like nostalgic in a way. Like, it was just so fun to read a book that included those Korean drama elements. Now, I totally understand why some people may not like this book, who might think it's cheesy or that the plot has some holes, but I was just in it for the ride. I loved the inclusion of Korean culture and Romanized Korean. I just really loved all those aspects, and this book just spoke to my soul in so many ways, and I cannot wait to get to the companion novel very soon. It felt wrong not to include this on the list because I just personally found it so cute and swoon-worthy, and I just loved the story, and I love what Kat Cho was trying to do. So yeah, that is my number 13 pick. Next up for number 12, I have Red, White, and Royal Blue by Casey McQuiston. I just remember squealing with joy while reading this book. Now, I know when it first came out, like, everyone and their dog loved this book, but I feel like I've seen it on some people's like worst book of the year list this year because it's a little bit controversial, but I personally was all for it. Everyone probably knows what this is about already, but it follows the son of the first woman president in the United States, and it also follows a Prince of England, and it's kind of like a hate-to-love romance, but they don't really hate each other. Drama, the angst, the swoon-worthy moments, I just was all for this book. I just really loved the chemistry between Alex and Henry. I know some people don't like it, but I personally just thought that it was right on the mark. This book was super steamy while also being really sweet, and I really enjoyed that, and I think this is the first adult romance that I gave a full 5 stars, so I feel like I had to include it on this list. Ah, look who decided to come in. Ah! Okay, well, now that she's scratched me. I also really love the political aspect of this book. It actually follows an American election that's taking place in this world, like 2020, and it just felt good to escape for a little bit because the American political system, and for the last couple of years, has been horrid. I just remember really enjoying that escape aspect. Yeah, I felt like I had to include it on this list. At number 11, I have my first audiobook, and that is With the Fire on High by Elizabeth Acevedo. And this book is my favorite of Acevedo's work. There's just something about this book that has stuck with me and charmed me from the very beginning. This book follows a young girl named Imani, and she actually got pregnant when she was 14 and she had a daughter, and the book takes place while she is in high school trying to juggle, you know, raising her daughter, getting good grades, just something about the inclusion of teen moms I just really enjoyed. And there's also a lot of really important discussions on how if a girl gets pregnant when she's very young, the blame for that lies on the girl as opposed to the guy, and Imani really goes through people, you know, judging her and, you know, thinking that she's a slut and all these kind of things, while the father of her child is kind of gets off scot-free and even like applauded for getting this girl pregnant when she was only 14 and vulnerable. Again, I liked the inclusion of teen moms because I feel like I've never read a YA book that featured a teen mom before. And also, the book is not totally about that. It mainly follows Imani and her love for cooking. She ends up signing up for this cooking club at school where at the end of the semester they will go to Spain to visit and to cook and like learn about the culinary arts. I think has a little bit of magical realism in it, as in when Amani cooks, she can end up making people cry and relive memories. I just thought, you know, this girl can cook really well, but I saw some reviews that said it actually has like a little bit of like a magical element to it. I just really adored watching Amani, you know, have this passion for cooking. Meanwhile, like I, you know, can barely make buttered toast. So it was really inspiring to see her be so passionate about this. For me, like I keep thinking about this book because it was that powerful. It was that good. And so I really want to reread it at some point just to experience it again. But yeah, this is number 11. Also, I would highly recommend the audiobook for this because Elizabeth Acevedo narrates it herself, and it just gives it that little extra spice. See what I did there? Spice cooking. At number 10, I have another audiobook, and that is Radio Silence by Alice Oseman. I actually considered putting this in my most surprising books of the year, but I decided not to because I had heard a ton of really good things. This book just caught me so off guard about how much I just adored it and all the messages. This book takes place in England and the audiobook narrator is British. I loved listening to the audiobook narrator. There's a girl named Frances, and she is obsessed with this podcast called Universe City, and one day she ends up meeting the creator, and it ends up being someone that's related to someone at her school, and they kind of form this totally platonic friendship. It was one of my favorite aspects of the book. Frances tells you up front that they're not going to fall in love, that this is purely a friendship book. Didn't know how much I needed a book that focused solely on friendship. Now there were some side relationships, and also there was a lot of queer representation. Like I think there's bisexual, lesbian, pansexual, demisexual. There's a lot of sexualities that are explored in this book, but they're not like the main focus. They just kind of are accepted as fact, and everyone just moves on. Because I feel like every single YA book has to include a romance. Like I feel like that's the general consensus, but they don't necessarily all have to include a romance. Now you guys know I love romance books. I read adult romance all the time, but I had no idea how much I needed that palate cleanser of a nice platonic friendship. This book also delves a lot into academic pressures that students face from the time that they are born. They are expected to go to college, and they're expected to be good at school, and they're expected to, you know, go to college, get a good job. But that's not necessarily the only path that is open. And so it follows Frances, who is very school focused, questioning whether or not, you know, she needs to even go to college, whether school is the right thing to her, or whether it was something that was just told that she had to do. You know, Frances's character development is another thing that was just chef's kiss. Rare that I feel so connected to like a group of characters than I did while reading this book. Now they did piss me off, you know, and they made me really upset with some of the miscommunication that was happening, but it was messy for a reason. As they learn and they grow, you know, and they become better people. Yeah, as I mentioned, there's a lot of different representation in terms of sexuality. There's also a bunch of different representations in terms of race in this book, and this book was just so full of love and life. Yeah, I'm excited to read more about Alice Oseman because her books just seem right up my alley. And yeah, let's just move on because I feel like I've been talking about this book for 10 minutes. Number 9, I have Sleigh by Brittany Morris. This is a book that I did include in my most surprising books of the year. I think about this book all the time. I still think about it all the time, and I feel like I have to reread it because I just think about it constantly. It follows this black girl named Kira, and she makes this video game which is based on black culture. And I think that's kind of where I left it in my most surprising books of the year, but this book also goes into a lot of different topics, like the racism and sexism that are in the video game industry and how people think that this girl, especially this black girl, cannot make this video game. Also, there's a lot of discussions on racism because this book is focused on black culture. Kira wants to make it to where only black individuals can play this game, and then the white media gets a hold of this and thinks, oh, well, that's racist and discriminatory because you're not letting white people play. I also distinctly remember staying up all night listening to this audiobook and it being like 7 a.m. The sun was coming up, okay? And I could not put it down. I was so exhausted and my earphones kept dying and I kept having to switch earphones, and there was this frantic, I have to know what happens because there's this twist that happens at the end that blew my mind. This was just such a fun experience and I will never forget it. And yeah, I highly recommend this book. This is, again, one that I wasn't expecting to really love, but it just had so many good moments and so many good messages in it. I highly recommend that you check this out because it was just such a gem. I loved it. Number 8 on the list is The Invisible Life of Addie LaRue. Whew! Let's talk about this one. This one was so amazing. I mentioned this in my November wrap-up about how I absolutely loved this book and I thought that it was going to be like my favorite book of the whole year, but as you can see how it is only number 8 on the list, I ended up having to bump it down because I did not really enjoy the ending. It was just not for me, and I think the ending is going to be very polarizing in general. I could not ignore the fact that everything else about the book was right up my alley. Beautiful, wonderful, exquisite. This book follows a girl named Addie LaRue who makes a deal with the devil in order to live forever, but the the catch is that as soon as she is out of the line of sight of people, they totally forget her. So in one way, she is totally free of any obligations that she had in her young life, but on the other hand, she can never form any human connections. And this book follows Addie through 300 years, and suddenly she finds a guy who actually does remember her, and that like throws like a whole thing off. Like I said, everything except the ending was perfection. I tabbed all these amazing quotes, and this book was so bookish and artsy, and it paid so much like close attention to the love of art in all of its forms. Camera totally died in the middle of my sentence, so if the angle is different, that is why. This book was so magical and beautiful and heart-wrenching at times, but it had these small glimmers of hope that I just clung onto, and I just completely devoured it when I read it. So I think that this definitely lives up to the hype. I know some people don't like it, but I personally just loved it. And even though I wish the ending was different, I can respect the choices that were made, just because the majority of the reading experience was one of my favorites of the year. So yeah. Next, I have another recent read, which is why I don't do these end of the year videos until the end of December, early January, because I actually did read this one in December, and that is The Poppy War by R.F. Kuang. I went into this kind of knowing that it was going to be on my favorites list because just everyone had been talking about it, and it lived up to the hype for me. It really did. This is a really dark and gritty fantasy. Like, trigger warnings for everything that you could think of, especially like explicit genocide, violence, rape. You know, there is a chapter in this book that is really difficult to read, but it follows a girl named Rin, and she ends up studying her ass off in order to get into this really prestigious military academy. Even though she is super poor, she is able to get a super high score on this test. So half of the book is her kind of training at this military academy and, you know, kind of coming into her own, and then at the halfway point we are at war, and Rin has to go to war with her fellow classmates, and there's a lot of death, a lot of destruction. You know, I want to shake Rin because she makes some decisions that, girl. Rin is definitely a morally gray character, which I think is why I love reading about her so much, because she was just a mess. Decisions were a big yikes at some point. Now, this book is actually based on Asian history. Specifically, this one is the Sino-Japanese War, and I know the other books in the series, which I haven't read, I think focus on like the Chinese Civil War. And yeah, this book was horrible to read, as in like it was just so gut-wrenching, but at the same time it is so profound and remarkable. I just loved it, and I cannot wait to continue on with the rest of the series. I cannot believe that R. Kuang wrote this when she was a teenager, but it definitely was very profound and impactful on me. That's why it's on this list. So we go from the Poppy War, which is like this bloody violent mess, to the biggest hug of a book, and that is The House in the Cerulean Sea by T.J. Klune. I feel like this is going to be on a ton of people's favorite books of the year list. As like everyone else says, this book is just the most sweet book that I could like fathom. It was just such a hug. It was such a good time. It was such a palate cleanser. It follows a guy named Linus Baker, who is kind of like a social worker for magical children, to go along to all of these magical orphanages and determine whether the children are being taken care of. And his life is pretty great until he gets assigned this special orphanage that actually contains the most dangerous children, and it has this like group of children. They range from all kinds of various things, like a green blob, the Antichrist, you know, a gnome, things that just seem so nonsensical, but somehow in this book you fall in love with every single one of the kids. Like, you would die for them. Like, I guarantee if you read this book, you will die for all of these kids. And he ends up meeting the caretaker of this orphanage, and just I will say this book isn't like absolutely 100% totally happy all the time, because in this society the magical children are actually discriminated against quite heavily. So the house that these children are living in actually borders on this town, and the town is actually really discriminatory towards these children. The children do face some nasty comments, but overall this book was just so sweet. So yeah, I just get such like a comforting and safe feeling when I think about this book, and so it was just such a joy. I had to include it on the list. It had to be high on the list, and yeah, this was just such a joy. But number 5 is a book that I've been talking about on like separate platforms ever since I read it, and that is Felix Ever After by Case and Calendar. I actually took a YA literature class this past semester in college, and for this extra credit assignment I ended up doing a YA blog. Like, I made one. No, I will not tell you what it is because it is a huge mess, but I did post on that blog pretty frequently, and every single blog post that I made I tried to include this book. Like, I can't exactly pinpoint exactly what made this book stand out so far past all the other YA contemporaries that I have read, read this year or like ever, but there was just something about it. It follows this transgender, black, and queer boy named Felix Love, and all he wants to do is fall in love. And he's going to this art program at his school over the summer, and one day he walks into school and all over the lobby someone has posted his dead name along with old pictures of him before his transition, and it's very traumatic for Felix, and so he vows to get revenge on whoever did this to him. The book is really messy. Like, Felix makes some decisions that, you know, are not the best, and he does harbor a lot of resentment within this book, but I just thought the journey was one that was totally remarkable. I really loved the talks about all the different sexualities within this book because this book features a complete queer cast of characters. This book is about love and friendship and what it means to be betrayed and family and sexuality and finding yourself. Felix as a character felt so real to me. It is like hard to describe how real he felt and all the things that he was going through. Even though I don't relate like personally, he still felt like such a relatable character as he was trying to find himself and fall in love for the first time. This book also, like, even though it deals with some heavy topics like dead naming and, you know, it can be triggering for some people, I also just found it really lighthearted and hilarious, and there were just so many moments in this book that made me smile. There's also a lot of exploration of family dynamics in this book as Felix is struggling to convince his parents, specifically his father, of his new identity, and you kind of had this push and pull between them, and I just really thought that that was really well done as well. And overall, this book truly reignited my love for YA contemporaries. I had felt for the longest time I was just like, I'm done with YA contemporaries, I don't really want to read them anymore, I'd rather do adult romances, but this book really reignited that love for me, and it was just truly remarkable. Please read it. It is so important. It truly lives up to the hype for me, and I think is one of my favorite YA contemporaries of all time. Please read it, make my heart happy, and please read this book. Next up at number 4, again, we are getting really down to it now, guys. I have Raybearer by Jordan Afueco, and we need to talk about this, guys, real quick. We need to pause. Why have more people not read this book? There's only like 3,000 reviews on Goodreads. Please, why have more people not read this book? This is like my favorite YA fantasy of all time. This is an African-inspired YA fantasy that follows a girl named Terasai who has never really had a family before. She is raised by this mysterious figure called the Lady, who is technically her mother, but also is very neglectful, and raises her in isolation to eventually fulfill her purpose of killing the crown prince. And in order to do this, Terasai is actually sent to the capital when she is only 13, I think, maybe 12, but I think 13, in order to compete in this competition in order to get on the crown prince's Sacred Council of 11, which includes 11 individuals that swear their life to protect their crown prince and eventually, obviously, the king. This is one of the best world building that I've ever read, and is one of the most interesting worlds that I've ever read about. Like, the magic system was so freaking cool. Another thing that I thought was really interesting is we don't just follow Terasai when she is like a teenager, we also follow her as a child, and it kind of leads up and we kind of follow her as she grows up. Also, the mythology and history of this world is told through songs, which I thought was really interesting. They're trying to focus on her, focus on me, oh my god. Focus on me. Like, we know Terasai is a bad bitch, okay, but you gotta focus on me. Going back to this magic system, because it needs to be talked about, it was so unique. Basically, the crown prince and each member of the 11 are protected by this thing called the Ray, which allows them to speak in each other's minds, know when the other one is hurt. And it's really interesting because if the Council of 11 are separated from each other for too long, they start to get super sick. And so the council and the crown prince all like sleep together, like in the same room, because if they don't, then they start getting super sick. Just the nature of this magic system, the Ray, it depends so much on consent between the council member and the crown prince, or the council member and each other. It is so focused on consent, and you have to love each other both ways in order for this Ray to work. And so this Council of 11 have to become so close to each other and so close to the crown prince, and so they develop this deep bond with each other. This book also has ace representation in it, which I think is not talked about enough. Have I convinced you yet that this book is cool as shit? Like, this book is so cool. Jordan Afueco, this is her debut novel, which is just so impressive to me. If I haven't said it enough, I'm gonna say it one more time. Please read this book. It is fabulous. We're down to the final 3, everyone, which all of these could be considered number 1 in my mind. Like, at this point, they get like so foggy because they were just all so excellent. Number 3, I decided to go with Crescent City, or House of Earth and Blood by Sarah J. Maas. This is, I think, my first huge bulky fantasy that I had read after coming out of like my 2-year-long reading slump. I am Sarah J. Maas trash. You know, I understand that the main guy in this book, Hunt, is a combination of Rhysand and Rowan. You know, I get it. But I was here for it. This book was also really slow for the first like 400 pages, which, you know, can make it really hard for some people to get through. But once you get past like those first 400 pages, things just start going at the speed of light. And I vividly remember, again, staying up at like 7 o'clock in the morning, furiously going through this book because the climax of this book was one of my favorite that I've ever read in a fantasy book. Like, it was so action-packed and insane. Like, the climax of this book was insane. I didn't really say what it was about before launching into my thoughts about it. Sorry, when I think about this book, I just have to gush. This book is really complicated to explain because it's a very complex fantasy world that includes all kinds of magical creatures. Like, you got vampires, werewolves, fairies, you know, the undead, got all kinds of stuff going on in this book. This is also an urban fantasy, so even though it includes all of those magical creatures, it also is like set in everyday world, like the cell phones and computers and stuff like that within this world. But at its core, I really think this book is about friendship and grief. At the beginning of this book, our main character Bryce actually loses someone who is really close to her, and so the rest of the book basically follows her trying to figure out what happened to this person that was really close to her and vowing revenge on whoever killed them. And you know, it broke my heart. It really did. This book was just truly fantastic, and for a time I thought that it was going to be my favorite book of the whole year, but the reason why it's not my favorite is because, again, those first couple hundred pages were a little bit slow, so I did not love it like from page one, but I did really enjoy it overall. Okay, now we're down to my final two, and I still in my mind am thinking, should I switch them? You know, I'm just going to go with my gut. Number two, I have Take a Hint, Danny Brown by Talia Hibbert. This book really, when I was preparing yesterday, felt like my favorite book of the year because I think of it and my heart just bursts. Like, I just get so happy while thinking of this book, and I finally have a physical copy of this book. I listened to it at first on audio, and I really loved the audiobook, but I knew that I had to have a physical copy because it is one of my favorite books of the entire year. But I haven't talked about this book enough. I feel like I've commented on all my friends' videos too, talking about this book as well. So I feel like a little bit of a broken record. This is the second book in the Brown Sisters trilogy. It follows this academic named Danica Brown, and she really, you know, isn't looking for a serious relationship. She mostly just wants to hit it and quit it, but she is very independent and doesn't really want to be tied down by a relationship. It also follows a guy named Zafir, who is the softest cinnamon roll ever. He reads romance novels, he has anxiety, loved the anxiety rap within this book, and he's also a rugby player, and he kind of has like an organization or a charity that is a charity for children, and so he's just the sweetest guy. And basically something happens to where Zafir has to rescue Danny from like an elevator, and a video of them goes viral on the internet. So in order to get publicity for his charity, they end up forming a absolutely beautiful bond with each other, and it was such a healthy relationship. Like, I feel like in a lot of adult romances, the romance might not be necessarily the healthiest, especially at the beginning. Another thing that I really loved about this book is that the third act conflict, if you've read adult romance, you know that there's always something that ridiculous that happens in the third act in order to break up the couple and for them to eventually come back together. That is like the formula for an adult romance. This book had that, but it was not stupid. Conflict at the end made total sense to me, and that's actually a reason why I did not enjoy the previous book in the series, Get a Life, Chloe Brown, because I thought that third act conflict was ridiculous. This book was steamy while also being adorable and sweet, and it just had everything that I could ever want in an adult romance, and this is by far my favorite adult romance that I've ever read, and it is the standard. She is the standard by which I'm going to judge all of my other adult romances because it is absolutely perfect in my mind. Like, I need to reread it to see if I can find any flaws because I'm not thinking of any of them right now. Like, this book was perfect. Another reason I really loved this book is just the family dynamics within the Brown sisters. Like, their family dynamic is just so supportive, and I really like my romance novels to have that family element or a friendship element that makes it stand out. Like, I really love books that deal with families. Before I keep going on and on and on and just becoming like an inarticulate mess saying like love, 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 love this book, I'm gonna stop now. I still think this might be my favorite book of the year, but I'm going to stop talking about this one and talk about the book that I actually ranked number one. So my official favorite book of the year, and that's going to have to be The Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo by Taylor Jenkins Reid. I wonder if anyone guessed this. I talked about it, I think, in my mid-year wrap-up where I was saying that this and Crescent City were tied for my favorite books of the year, but I feel like with Take a Hint, Danny Brown, I think that one really satisfied my fangirl side, the cutesy, romantic side of me, but this one I feel like satisfied a different part of my soul, if that makes sense. This book feels just that it's in a different playing field than any other book that I've read this year. This book was super popular when it came out like a couple years ago, but I was late to the ball game, but now I have finally read it and I totally really absolutely understand the hype. This book follows a Hollywood actress named Evelyn Hugo as she tells her extensive life story to this reporter named Monique, and it follows her as she is a 1960s Hollywood star. It follows her 7 husbands, all the drama that happens, everything that she has to do in order to get leading roles in movies. This deals a lot with, you know, racism, sexism, classism in the Hollywood movie industry. This book also includes a queer cast of characters. This is another book that could have gone in my most surprising books of the year because I didn't really know if this was going to be my thing. I had heard like so much praise for it, but I really wasn't sure if I was going to like a book about a 60s Hollywood actress, but boy was I wrong. This book touched my soul in ways that I could never actually describe. I feel like this book was so impactful on me, I just had to keep it as my #1 favorite book. Again, this book is really about Evelyn Hugo, and she bears her soul for this reporter. It also has a lot of talk about sexuality and what it means to be bisexual and lesbian, and this book feels so real. Like, Evelyn Hugo feels like a real person. This book was just purely brilliant. I feel like I don't have the words to truly articulate how brilliant and wonderful it was. I just feel so privileged having read this story. Even though Evelyn Hugo is not the perfect heroine, she makes some mistakes and she's not the best person. This book is messy, but it is oh so human. And again, it's just so hard to describe how wonderful this book is. I know I'm sounding so inarticulate and I'm so sorry. I think this is just why this is my favorite book of the year, because I cannot explain to you exactly why. It is just feels like it's in a league of its own, honestly. Yeah, this book made me cry buckets at the end. It is truly a gem, and it definitely lives up to the hype. Yeah, I'm so happy that I read this book this year. I feel like it was the perfect time for me personally to read it. That was a long-ass video. Thank you guys so much for watching. Please let me know what your favorite book of the year is, because I would love to know. Give this video a like if you really enjoyed it. Hope everyone is staying safe, and I will see you later in another video very soon. Bye!